I never thought a simple flight could change my life. I boarded that plane tired, quiet, ready to just close my eyes and forget the world for a few hours. But then he sat down beside me. A stranger, yet somehow familiar, the kind of presence that makes your heartbeat stumble before you even know his name. At first, it was nothing more than polite smiles, a casual nod, the usual distance we all keep on planes. But then something happened, something small, unexpected, and powerful enough to shift the course of everything I thought I knew about myself, about love, and about the chances life gives us when we least expect them. The airport was crowded, loud, and restless, yet all I wanted was silence. I had been on the move for weeks, chasing deadlines, running from feelings I didn't want to face, and trying to convince myself that I was perfectly fine being alone. Traveling had become my escape. I thought if I kept flying from one place to another, I could leave my loneliness behind in every city I passed through. But loneliness has a way of sneaking into your carry-on, following you through security, and taking a seat right beside you. By the time I reached the boarding gate, I was exhausted, not just physically, but deep down where my soul ached. I wasn't looking for adventure or connection. I just wanted to get through the flight without anyone bothering me. When the gate attendant called my group, I dragged myself forward, keeping my eyes low, not in the mood to exchange pleasantries with anyone. Once inside the aircraft, I slid into my window seat, tucked my bag under the chair, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I pressed my head against the cool surface of the window and stared out at the runway, trying to ground myself in the hum of engines and flashing lights. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could disappear into my thoughts until we landed. And then he arrived. I felt movement before I even looked up. Someone was making their way down the aisle, smiling apologetically as people shifted to let him through. When he stopped at my row, I realized he was my seatmate. He gave me a polite smile, the kind that said, "Sorry for squeezing past you," and I quickly shifted to let him in. At first glance, there was nothing extraordinary about him. He was dressed casually, his hair a little messy from the airport rush, a backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder. But there was something in the way he carried himself, a warmth in his expression, a gentleness in his eyes that made me notice him more than I wanted to. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just tired and imagining a spark that didn't exist. Still, as he settled into his seat beside me, I couldn't help but feel my pulse pick up, just slightly. The flight attendants gave their routine safety instructions, and I tried to distract myself by pulling out my headphones. But even with music playing faintly in my ears, I was aware of him. His arm brushed mine lightly as he adjusted his seatbelt. The faint smell of his cologne drifted toward me, clean and subtle, the kind that lingers without trying too hard. I shifted uncomfortably, not because it bothered me, but because it didn't. It had been so long since I had felt this kind of awareness around someone, this quiet, nervous electricity that I had almost forgotten existed. As the plane began to taxi, he leaned slightly toward me and asked, "Do you fly often?" His voice was calm, low, and steady, like he was speaking only to me despite the noise around us. I pulled one earbud out, startled that he had broken the silence. "Sometimes," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "Work keeps me moving a lot." He nodded thoughtfully, like he understood more than I had said. "Same here. I'm always in the air. Sometimes I wonder if I've spent more time in airports than at home." I gave him a small smile, not wanting to seem rude, though part of me still hesitated to open up. But there was something disarming about him. He didn't push, didn't fill the silence with meaningless chatter. He just sat there, comfortably present, as though he respected the invisible walls I had built while still leaving a door open if I wanted to step through. The engines roared, the plane lifted, and for a moment, I felt the usual rush of anxiety that came with takeoff. I gripped the armrest, my jaw tight, until I felt the soft brush of his hand against mine. It was so subtle I thought it might have been accidental, but when I glanced at him, he was looking straight ahead, calm as ever, like it was nothing. Still, that single touch sent a ripple through me. I told myself to look away, to keep the distance, but I didn't. I watched the way his eyes softened as he stared out the window, the quiet curve of his lips as if he was lost in a pleasant thought. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt safe. Safe in a way I hadn't felt in years. When the plane leveled out and the seatbelt sign turned off, he turned back to me with a small grin. "I'm Daniel, by the way." For a second, I hesitated. My instinct was to keep things short, keep things polite, and move on. But instead, I surprised myself. "I'm Aaron," I said softly, almost like the name carried more weight than usual. His grin widened, and in that moment, it felt like the walls I had been hiding behind for so long began to crack, just a little. It was such a small exchange, so ordinary on the surface, yet I could feel something stirring inside me, something I hadn't expected, something that scared me but also made me curious. The flight had only just begun, but already, I could sense that this journey would be different. The plane hummed steadily as it cut through the clouds, but inside, I felt anything but steady. I had told myself countless times that I didn't need connections, that small talk with strangers was just noise, yet somehow Daniel's presence beside me wasn't noise at all. It was grounding, unsettling, and oddly comforting at the same time. He didn't crowd me with endless questions like some seatmates did. Instead, he let moments stretch, filling the air with pauses that didn't feel awkward. It was in those pauses that I caught myself studying him when I thought he wasn't looking, the slope of his shoulders, the calm way he rested his hands, the quiet confidence in how he took up space without ever imposing on mine. I hated how curious I was becoming. I wasn't supposed to notice these things. I had built a life around keeping people at arm's length, convincing myself that intimacy was too complicated, too fragile, too fleeting. And yet here I was, sitting next to someone who made the cabin air feel different, lighter somehow, though I barely knew a single thing about him. It was Daniel who eventually broke the quiet again. He glanced at the book I had pulled from my bag and asked, "Is it good?" His question was casual, but there was a genuine interest in his tone that made me pause before answering. I turned the book in my hands, suddenly aware that I hadn't actually read more than a few pages of it during all my recent trips. "It's fine," I said, shrugging, "but honestly, I think I just carry it around so I look less like I'm sitting alone." His laughter surprised me, low and easy, not mocking but understanding. "I do the same," he admitted, nodding toward the notebook tucked into the seat pocket in front of him. "I pretend to write in it so people don't try to talk to me. Funny thing is, I end up writing more than I planned because of it." There was something in the way he said it that made me smile, despite myself. His honesty felt raw, unpolished, like he wasn't trying to impress me or perform. He was just telling the truth, and it was refreshing. As the flight attendants began their routine with carts clinking down the aisle, Daniel leaned back in his seat and asked where I was headed. I hesitated, wondering how much to share, but then I found myself telling him about the conference I was attending in another city, how work had consumed most of my life lately, how I barely remembered what home even felt like. His eyes didn't drift, didn't glaze over like most people's do when you speak too much about work. Instead, he listened, really listened, like every word mattered. And then he surprised me. "You sound tired," he said gently, not as a criticism but as an observation, like he could see beneath my words to the exhaustion I had tried to mask. My throat tightened slightly because he was right, and no one had said it out loud before. I wanted to deflect, to make a joke, but instead all I managed was a soft, "Yeah. I am." He nodded, as though confirming something he already knew. You know, I used to think constant travel was exciting, he said, glancing toward the small oval window. All those different places, new faces, never staying still. But after a while, you realize it's just another way of running. Running from quiet moments that force you to think about what you really want. His words hit me harder than I expected. It was like he had peeked directly into the parts of me I tried to keep hidden. I shifted in my seat, suddenly uncomfortable with how much he seemed to understand without me saying a thing. But there was no judgment in his voice, no pity. Just truth. And truth has a way of piercing you when you least expect it. The flight attendant stopped at our row, handing us small plastic cups of water and the usual pretzels. We murmured our thanks, but I could feel Daniel's earlier words lingering between us, as heavy as the hum of the engines. I sipped my drink slowly, trying to shake it off, but it clung to me. And then, without warning, he turned back to me and asked the one question I hadn't been prepared for. "Are you happy, Aaron?" It was such a simple question, but it felt like a punch in the chest. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, searching for an easy answer, but there wasn't one. I thought about the long nights in hotel rooms, the endless flights, the people I had pushed away, the half-lived connections that never lasted beyond a conversation or a smile. I thought about how I always claimed independence like it was a badge of honor, yet deep down, it often felt more like a sentence. "I don't know," I admitted finally, my voice quieter than I intended. Daniel didn't react right away. He just looked at me, his gaze steady and unflinching, like he wasn't afraid of my uncertainty. Finally, he said, "It's okay not to know. But it's not okay to stop asking yourself the question." His words sank deep, leaving me restless and strangely hopeful at the same time. The rest of the flight passed in a rhythm I didn't expect. We talked about music, books, random little things, but beneath it all there was this undercurrent, this pull I couldn't ignore. It wasn't about flirting or charm, it was about recognition. Like sitting next to him had stripped away some invisible layer and left me exposed, yet strangely safe. By the time the captain's voice crackled through the speakers announcing our descent, I realized I wasn't ready for the flight to end. I wasn't ready to let this stranger walk out of my life at the baggage claim, fading into the crowd like everyone else had. And though I didn't want to admit it to myself, I already knew, Daniel was no longer just a seatmate. He was the beginning of something I didn't yet understand, but desperately wanted to. The plane tilted gently as it began its slow descent, and the city lights below started to glow like scattered stars. Normally, this was the part of the journey I hated most, the transition, the waiting, the reminder that every arrival was just another temporary stop. But this time felt different. My chest carried a strange heaviness, a mix of anticipation and dread, because I knew in just a short while the flight would end, and so would the fragile bubble of connection Daniel and I had built in the sky. I kept stealing glances at him, wondering if he felt it too, this reluctance to let the moment pass. He looked calm, resting against the headrest, his fingers tracing the rim of the empty cup in his hand as though deep in thought. I wanted to say something, to keep the conversation alive before it was swallowed by the sound of landing gear and safety announcements, but I couldn't find the right words. Everything that came to mind felt either too much or not enough. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin preparing everyone for landing, Daniel finally turned to me. "You know," he said softly, his voice carrying over the low hum of the engines, "sometimes the people we meet by chance aren't accidents at all." His words hung in the air, simple yet loaded with meaning. My heart stumbled in my chest because I had been thinking something similar, but hearing it from him made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. I managed a small, almost nervous smile. "That's a nice thought," I replied, though my voice betrayed the storm I was holding inside. He nodded, like he wasn't expecting me to fully agree, just to hear it and let it sit. The wheels hit the runway with a jolt, and the cabin filled with the familiar chorus of sighs, clicks of seatbelts, and the rustling of passengers eager to stand. I moved slowly, almost deliberately, as though prolonging the inevitable. Daniel remained seated too, his calmness steadying me. When it was finally our turn to stand, he reached up to grab his backpack from the overhead compartment, and I couldn't help noticing how effortless he made even the simplest gesture look. I collected my own bag, all the while battling a gnawing question inside me: would I walk away from this as if it never happened, or would I take a step I hadn't dared to take in a long time? The line of passengers inched forward, spilling out into the jet bridge, and soon the two of us were swallowed into the flood of people. The air outside the cabin was cooler, thinner, and it felt like the connection we shared was already beginning to dissolve into the chaos of voices, footsteps, and rolling suitcases. We walked side by side in silence, and every step closer to baggage claim felt like grains of sand slipping through my fingers. I hated the thought of letting him vanish into the crowd, yet I couldn't gather the courage to stop him. What if I was reading too much into everything? What if to him, this had just been another flight, another stranger, another passing conversation? At the carousel, we stood waiting as luggage tumbled out and passengers snatched their belongings. Daniel looked at me, his expression unreadable, then said, "Well, this is the part where we disappear into our own lives again, isn't it?" His words cut through me like a quiet blade. There was a softness in them, though, as if he was giving me an opening, a chance to contradict him. My throat tightened as I forced myself to speak. "I guess it doesn't have to be," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. His eyebrows lifted slightly, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes, surprise, maybe even hope that he studied me in silence, and I suddenly became hyper-aware of how vulnerable I had made myself with that simple statement. Before he could reply, his bag came sliding onto the carousel, and he bent to pull it off. The moment stretched painfully long. He stood with the bag in hand, his eyes still locked on me, and finally he smiled. Not a broad smile, but the kind that carried weight, the kind that meant something. "Then maybe it doesn't have to be," he said quietly. Relief washed over me so suddenly that I almost laughed, but instead I nodded, gripping my own bag handle tighter to steady myself. That we walked together toward the exit, both of us slower than necessary, like we were unwilling to let the steps between us and the doors count down too quickly. Outside the terminal, the night air was cool, and the city buzzed with movement. Taxis honked, people hurried past, and yet it felt like everything blurred except for the space we shared. Daniel shifted his bag on his shoulder, his gaze fixed on me. "I've got a hotel a few blocks away," he said carefully, like he was testing the waters. "What about you?" My heart pounded because I knew this was another opening, another choice that mattered. "Same," I answered softly, though in truth my hotel was on the opposite side of the city. I didn't care that he chuckled lightly, sensing my hesitation, then asked, "Would you, maybe want to grab a coffee before we disappear into those separate rooms?" The way he phrased it, gentle, unassuming, leaving me space to say no, made it even harder to resist. I swallowed, my voice lower than I expected when I replied, "Yeah, I'd like that." His smile widened, and in that instant, I knew something irreversible had happened. This wasn't just chance anymore. This wasn't just a flight. It was the beginning of something that already felt too important to let slip away. That we started walking toward the row of cafes still open near the terminal, the air filled with the hum of traffic and late-night chatter. My chest was tight with nervousness, but underneath it all was a quiet spark of something else, something fragile yet undeniable. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't just passing through another city. I was stepping into the unknown, guided not by the flight plan or the schedules I usually clung to, but by the possibility of connection that had landed right beside me at 30,000 feet. And though I couldn't name it yet, I knew I wanted more. The coffee shop we found was tucked in a corner of the terminal, one of those small places that stayed open late for travelers arriving at odd hours. It wasn't crowded, just a handful of people hunched over laptops or sipping quietly at tables. The soft hum of conversation mixed with the smell of fresh espresso, and for a moment it felt like we had stepped into a bubble separate from the frantic energy of the airport outside. We ordered quickly, both choosing coffee we probably didn't need at that hour, and sat at a small table near the window. The city lights outside flickered faintly in the glass, reflecting us back at ourselves, as though even the night was watching. At first, we talked about safe things, travel, places we'd been, funny stories from airports. He told me about a time his luggage had ended up in another country, and I laughed harder than I had in months. I shared a story about a flight delay that had turned into an unexpected adventure, and he leaned in closer, his eyes alive with curiosity. Every time he smiled, something stirred inside me, pulling at parts of myself I thought I had buried. But then the conversation slowed, and in that quiet space, something deeper started to emerge. He set his cup down and looked at me with a seriousness that caught me off guard. "You seemed restless up there on the plane," he said softly. "Like you were carrying something heavy." I froze for a moment, his words striking too close to the truth. I could have brushed it off, made a joke, or changed the subject. But instead, I found myself speaking words I hadn't planned to share. "I guess I've been running," I admitted, my fingers tracing the rim of my cup. Running from feelings I didn't want to face. From the silence that waits when the workday ends. I thought if I stayed busy enough, if I kept moving, I wouldn't notice how empty everything felt. My voice trembled slightly, and I hated how vulnerable I sounded, but Daniel didn't look away. He didn't frown or shift uncomfortably. He just listened, really listened, with an intensity that felt almost foreign in a world where people usually only half hear you. "I know that feeling," he said quietly after a moment. "You think the noise will drown it out, but somehow it only gets louder. I used to do the same thing. Kept chasing opportunities, kept traveling, kept filling my schedule. Until one day I woke up and realized I hadn't let anyone close to me in years." He paused, his gaze steady on mine. "Loneliness can feel like safety if you tell yourself the story long enough." His words hit me harder than I wanted to admit. I looked away, out at the cars pulling up outside the terminal, headlights slicing through the night. My chest ached because he was saying things I had only dared to think in the quietest corners of my mind. When I finally looked back, his expression had softened, like he could see my struggle but didn't judge me for it. "You don't have to tell me everything," he added gently. "But you don't have to hide either." That sentence undid something inside me. I had spent so long hiding behind busyness, behind the safety of being just a passing face in every city I visited. And here was this man, this stranger who shouldn't matter, telling me I didn't have to carry it alone. My throat tightened, and for a moment I couldn't speak. So instead, I nodded, letting the silence between us say everything words couldn't. We sat there for what felt like hours, though time blurred in that little cafe. We shared pieces of ourselves, some light, some heavy. He told me about his family, how they had struggled to accept parts of who he was, but how he had learned to live in his truth anyway. I confessed that I had never really let myself be honest about my own heart, that I had built walls out of fear and shame. The more we spoke, the more the walls between us crumbled. It wasn't dramatic, no grand declarations or sudden confessions, just the slow, steady unfolding of two people finally letting themselves be seen. When our cups were empty and the cafe grew quieter, I realized how late it had become. The exhaustion of travel pulled at me, but beneath it was a strange warmth, a calm I hadn't felt in years. As we stood to leave, Daniel looked at me in a way that made the air feel different, heavier, like something important was about to happen. He didn't reach for me, didn't make a bold move, but his eyes lingered, asking a question without words. My heart raced because I knew exactly what he was asking. Was this just a moment to be left behind, or was it the beginning of something real? Outside, the night air wrapped around us, cool and sharp. We walked slowly, side by side, neither of us in a rush to end the evening. At the edge of the street where our paths would inevitably part, I hesitated. My hotel was to the left, his to the right, and it felt like standing at a crossroads I wasn't ready to face. I turned to him, searching for words, but he beat me to it. "I'm glad I sat next to you," he said softly. His voice carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I swallowed hard, my reply quieter than I intended. Me too. For a long moment, we just stood there, the sounds of the city rushing past us while time seemed to stand still. I wanted to say more, to ask for more, but fear tangled my tongue. And then, before either of us could step away, he said, "Maybe this doesn't have to end here." My breath caught, and in that instant, I felt the truth of it settle deep inside me. This wasn't just a chance meeting. This was a door opening, and I knew, with a certainty that scared and thrilled me, that I wanted to walk through it. The city around us never stopped moving, but in that moment, standing with Daniel on the quiet edge of the terminal street, it felt like the world had slowed just for us. His words, "Maybe this doesn't have to end here," echoed in my head with a weight I couldn't shake. I wanted to answer immediately, to say yes, to admit that something inside me had shifted since the moment he sat beside me on the plane, but years of holding back made me hesitate. I stared at him, the glow of streetlights catching in his eyes, and for once I couldn't hide behind excuses. "I don't want it to end here," I admitted, my voice almost trembling. His expression softened into something that wasn't just relief, but recognition, as if he had been waiting for me to say those words all along. That we started walking again, not toward our hotels just yet, but aimlessly down the sidewalk, as though postponing the goodbye we both dreaded. The city was alive even at that late hour, with taxis darting past and neon signs flickering above small restaurants that stayed open deep into the night. Every step we took together felt strangely deliberate, like each footfall was stitching us further into one another's story. Daniel spoke about his travels, the countless cities he had passed through, and how he had grown tired of everything blurring together into the same hotel rooms and airport lounges. I listened, nodding, because it was my story too, one I had been too afraid to admit out loud. Eventually, we stopped in front of a small park that sat quietly between two busy streets. The trees swayed gently in the night breeze, and the benches inside were mostly empty. Without speaking, we walked in and found a spot away from the streetlights, where the noise of the city dimmed enough to let silence breathe. I sat down first, my bag at my feet, and Daniel lowered himself beside me. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The quiet wasn't heavy or awkward, it was almost comforting, like we both needed space to gather ourselves. Finally, I broke the silence. "You make it sound so easy," I said quietly, staring at my hands. "Letting people in. Being open. I don't even know how to begin." Daniel shifted slightly to face me. His voice was calm, steady, the same way it had been on the plane when he first spoke to me. "It's not easy," he admitted. "It took me years to get here. And even now, sometimes I'm still scared. But I learned that fear doesn't go away if you keep running. It only grows. The only way it shrinks is if you face it, little by little." His words settled deep in me, unsettling and comforting at once. I let out a shaky laugh. "You make it sound like you've got it all figured out." He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Not even close. But I know what it feels like to miss out because I was too afraid. And I promised myself I wouldn't keep living like that." Something in the way he said it cracked something open in me. I leaned back against the bench, staring at the branches above, and the words tumbled out before I could stop them. "I've spent so much of my life pretending I didn't need anyone. I told myself it was easier, safer. But all it's done is leave me empty. And I don't know how to stop being afraid that if I let someone close, it'll all just fall apart." The confession left me feeling raw, exposed, like I had handed him a fragile part of myself I had never trusted anyone with. My heart pounded, waiting for his reaction, terrified of rejection. But Daniel didn't recoil. He didn't look away. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his voice low but firm. "Maybe it will fall apart. Maybe it won't. But if you never try, you'll never know what could have been. Isn't the risk worth it, even just once?" I turned my head to look at him then, really look at him. His eyes were steady, unwavering, and in them I saw something I hadn't felt in years: safety. Not the kind that comes from walls or distance, but the kind that comes from being seen and accepted anyway. I wanted to believe him, to believe that maybe it was worth the risk, even if it scared me. The silence between us stretched again, heavy with unspoken meaning. And then, almost instinctively, I let myself lean just a little closer. Not enough to bridge the space, but enough to make it clear that I wasn't running anymore. Daniel didn't move right away. He let the moment linger, giving me room to change my mind if I wanted. But when I didn't pull back, he leaned in too, closing the gap just enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence. Our shoulders brushed, a small touch, but it sent a ripple through me stronger than anything I had felt in years. We didn't kiss, not yet, but the closeness was enough to say what neither of us had dared to put into words. It was a promise, a beginning, fragile but real. The night stretched on, and we stayed there in the park, talking, falling into silences, then talking again. The longer we sat, the less the fear inside me screamed, replaced instead by a quiet hope I hadn't allowed myself to feel in so long. Eventually, exhaustion tugged at us, reminding us of the late hour, but neither of us wanted to leave. When we finally stood, walking side by side back toward the street, I realized something had shifted inside me. I wasn't just traveling anymore. I wasn't just running. For the first time in years, I was standing still, with someone who saw me, someone who stayed. And that realization scared me, but it also lit something in me I thought had died long ago. As we approached the corner where we would split off again toward our separate hotels, Daniel glanced at me, his voice soft. "I'd like to see you tomorrow. If you want that too." My heart leapt, and though fear still whispered in the back of my mind, I didn't hesitate this time. "I want that," I said firmly, surprising even myself with how certain I sounded. His smile was quiet but full of meaning, and I knew then that this wasn't just a fleeting encounter. This was the beginning of a story I hadn't dared to believe I deserved. And as we finally parted for the night, I carried that truth with me, heavy and light all at once, knowing tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. Morning crept in slowly, the kind of soft light that slips through curtains and stirs you awake without permission. I lay there in the unfamiliar hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind already restless. The memory of last night replayed in fragments, our conversation in the cafe, the quiet bench in the park, the unspoken closeness that felt heavier than any words could carry. I hadn't slept much, not because of noise or jet lag, but because my thoughts refused to settle. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel's face, heard the calm steadiness in his voice, and felt the weight of the risk I had taken by letting myself open up, even just a little. It had been years since I had let anyone slip past my defenses, and part of me was terrified. But another part, quieter yet stronger, was curious, even hopeful. By mid-morning, my phone buzzed with a message. I didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. My chest tightened as I picked it up, and there it was, *coffee. "There's a small place near the river I found this morning. Meet me, *. The simplicity of his words made me smile, because it wasn't loaded with pressure or expectation. Just an invitation. Still, my fingers hovered over the screen longer than they should have, debating if saying yes was a step too far. But then I remembered the way he looked at me last night, the way he said maybe it didn't have to end here, and I realized I didn't want to run anymore. So I typed back quickly, *yes. Text me the address, *. The cafe by the river turned out to be nothing fancy, just a small place with wooden tables and wide windows overlooking the water. But it had a quiet charm, the kind of spot people stumble upon and never forget. I spotted Daniel almost immediately, sitting at a table outside with 2 mugs of coffee already waiting. When his eyes met mine, he smiled, and it was the kind of smile that didn't just reach his mouth but lit something in his eyes, like he was genuinely glad I had come. I felt my nerves settle just a little as I sat across from him. I wasn't sure you'd say yes, he admitted softly, pushing one of the mugs toward me. I let out a small laugh, shaking my head. I wasn't sure I would either. We talked for a while, the kind of conversation that drifted easily between lightness and depth. He told me about his love for photography, how he carried his camera everywhere and tried to capture not just places but feelings. I admitted that I had stopped doing things I loved because work had taken over my life, draining me until hobbies felt like distant memories. He listened with that same attentiveness he always carried, and when he spoke, it was never to lecture or correct, but to share pieces of himself in return. Every word from him made me feel less like a stranger and more like someone being seen for the first time. After coffee, we walked along the river. The water glistened in the sunlight, and the air smelled faintly of damp stone and fresh bread from a nearby bakery. We strolled slowly, sometimes in silence, sometimes laughing at small observations. I was aware of the space between us, how close we walked without quite touching, and the tension in that space made my chest ache with both fear and longing. At one point, as we crossed a narrow bridge, he slowed down and glanced at me. You ever feel like some moments are heavier than others? Like the universe is holding its breath, waiting to see what you'll do? His words startled me because I had been thinking almost the same thing. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to answer honestly. Yeah. Right now feels like that. His gaze lingered on me, and for a brief second, the noise of the city around us faded into the background. It was just us, suspended in a fragile moment where anything could happen. But then he smiled faintly and kept walking, leaving me both relieved and aching at the same time. It wasn't rejection, it was patience. He wasn't rushing me, and that patience made me want him even more. That we spent the rest of the afternoon together, wandering through side streets, sharing bits of our lives we hadn't said before. I told him about the pressure I always felt to be the perfect version of myself for everyone else, and how exhausting it was to maintain that image. He shared how he had learned to let go of people who couldn't accept him fully, even though it hurt. With every story exchanged, the invisible weight I carried seemed to lighten, and the space between us felt less like a gap and more like a thread tying us together. As evening approached, we ended up back near the park where we had sat the night before. The bench was empty, waiting for us, and without needing to ask, we sat down again. The city lights began to glow, and I felt the same nervous electricity from before, only stronger. This time, I didn't lean away from it. Daniel turned toward me slightly, his voice lower now, almost careful. I don't want to push you, he said, his eyes steady on mine. But I want you to know that I'm here. Not just for tonight. Not just for a coffee. I'm here if you're ready to let someone in. The words hit me harder than I expected. I could feel the lump forming in my throat, the sting in my eyes that warned of tears I didn't want to shed in public. I had longed for someone to say something like that for years, but hearing it now was terrifying. Because it meant I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I couldn't keep hiding behind work or travel or the excuses I had built. He was offering me something real, and I had to decide if I was brave enough to reach for it. That I took a long breath, my voice unsteady as I answered. I'm scared, Daniel. More scared than I want to admit. But I don't want to run anymore. Not from this. Not from you. His expression softened, and for the first time since we met, he reached out. Not abruptly, not forcefully, but gently, his hand brushing against mine before resting there fully. The warmth of his touch seeped into me, steadying the storm inside. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. For the first time in years, the fear didn't outweigh the possibility that we sat there hand in hand as the city moved around us, and though I knew this was just the beginning, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Not the distant, fragile kind I used to bury, but the kind that made my chest ache with possibility. I realized then that whatever this was, wherever it would lead, I wanted to see it through. And with Daniel sitting beside me, patient and unshakable, I knew I finally had the chance. The night stretched out longer than either of us intended, but neither of us moved from that bench. The city glowed around us, headlights flickering on streets, laughter spilling from restaurants, the hum of life carrying on as if we weren't sitting there rewriting the story of our lives in real time. Daniel's hand was still on mine, steady and sure, and I kept staring at that small point of contact, as though it was proof that I wasn't dreaming. For years, I had avoided this exact thing: intimacy, vulnerability, the terrifying risk of being known, and now here I was, holding onto it like it was the one thing I couldn't let slip away. The fear was still there, whispering all the old doubts in the back of my mind, but something was louder now, the quiet certainty that I wanted this. I wanted him. And maybe wanting was enough to take the first real step. That we talked in fragments, not needing full conversations anymore. Little questions about favorite songs, places we wanted to see, meals that reminded us of home. Then heavier things slipped in, almost without warning: his first heartbreak, the loneliness of trying to be accepted by people who never fully understood him, the sting of rejection that had shaped him into someone both strong and cautious. I found myself sharing too, pieces of my past I had never given to anyone. The times I had silenced myself out of fear of judgment. The nights I had chosen solitude rather than risk being seen and turned away. Each confession felt like opening a locked door, and every time, Daniel walked through without hesitation, meeting me with understanding rather than judgment. At one point, I laughed bitterly at my own words, shaking my head. "You must think I'm a mess," I muttered. But he squeezed my hand lightly, his voice calm and steady when he replied, "I think you're human. And that's more than enough." Those words nearly undid me. For so long, I had equated my fears and my silence with weakness, but in his eyes, they weren't flaws. They were just part of me, and somehow he made even those parts feel worthy of being seen. Hours slipped by until the park grew emptier, the night colder. I shivered slightly, and Daniel immediately noticed, shrugging out of his jacket and draping it over my shoulders before I could protest. The warmth of it, carrying his faint scent, wrapped around me in a way that made me feel cared for in the simplest, most profound way. I wanted to say thank you, but the words stuck in my throat because gratitude didn't seem big enough for what I was feeling. Instead, I just looked at him, and the intensity of that look seemed to bridge the space between us. For a moment, I thought he might lean closer, close the distance that had hovered between us since the plane. But he didn't rush. He just held my gaze, letting me decide. And slowly, almost without realizing it, I leaned in, closing the gap myself. The kiss wasn't dramatic or rushed. It was soft, tentative, the kind that feels like a question rather than an answer. But it carried more weight than any words we had spoken. My heart raced, my body trembling with both fear and relief, because this was real. This was me choosing not to run, not to hide. When we finally pulled back, his forehead rested lightly against mine, and he whispered, "I've wanted to do that since the plane." My laugh came out unsteady, but it was real. "Me too," I admitted, surprising myself with the honesty. After that, the silence between us shifted. It wasn't filled with tension anymore, but with a new kind of closeness, fragile yet powerful. We sat together a while longer, my head resting against his shoulder, both of us content to let the world blur around us. I realized that I hadn't felt this kind of peace in years, the kind that comes from simply being with someone who makes you feel safe enough to breathe. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Eventually, exhaustion crept back in, reminding us how late it had become. Daniel glanced at me with a reluctant smile. "We should probably sleep," he said, though his tone carried the same resistance I felt. I nodded, not wanting the night to end but knowing it had to. We stood, and once again, we walked slowly toward the street, neither of us rushing the steps. This time, though, there was no uncertainty about what we wanted. At the corner where our paths split, Daniel stopped and turned to me. "Tomorrow?" he asked, his voice low, almost careful. I didn't even hesitate. Tomorrow, I promised that as I walked toward my hotel, his jacket still draped around me, I felt something shift deep inside. For the first time in years, I wasn't weighed down by loneliness. I wasn't lost in the endless cycle of running from one place to another. Instead, I felt anchored, tethered to something real. The fear was still there, yes, but it was smaller now, drowned out by the possibility of what could be. And as I lay in bed later that night, his kiss replaying in my mind, I realized that no matter what tomorrow held, I wanted to keep choosing this. I wanted to keep choosing him. The next morning arrived quietly, sunlight spilling through the thin curtains of my hotel room as though it was determined to pull me into the day before I was ready. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, still wrapped in Daniel's jacket that I had refused to take off the night before. The faint scent of him clung to the fabric, and every time I breathed it in, I felt the echo of his hand in mine, the warmth of his lips against mine, the softness of his voice when he asked for tomorrow. And now, tomorrow had become today. My heart beat faster at the thought, a mixture of nerves and anticipation that left me restless. For years, mornings had been routine, mechanical, defined by schedules and obligations. But this morning was different. This morning carried the weight of possibility, and I couldn't help but feel that whatever happened today might change everything that I spent longer than I wanted to admit debating what to wear, laughing at myself for caring so much about something so small. But it wasn't about the clothes, it was about the fact that for the first time in a long time, I wanted to be seen. Not as the polished version of myself I had worn like armor for years, but as me, in all my nervous, imperfect truth. By the time I left the hotel, my hands were trembling slightly, and I told myself it was just the coffee I hadn't yet had. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I was stepping into unfamiliar territory, one where I couldn't hide behind walls anymore. That we had agreed to meet at the small bookshop cafe near the square, a place Daniel had mentioned was one of his favorites. When I arrived, I saw him already there, sitting by the window with a book open in front of him, though he wasn't really reading. His head lifted the moment I stepped in, and his smile, soft, steady, and unguarded, made something inside me unravel. As I crossed the room, I realized just how much I wanted this, how much I had needed someone who looked at me that way, like I was worth waiting for. The hours we spent there blurred together. We talked about everything and nothing, about books we loved, about the dreams we hadn't dared to say aloud to anyone else. Daniel confessed he wanted to publish a collection of his photographs one day, not for fame or money, but so people could feel the same emotions he felt when he captured them. I told him about my longing to slow down, to stop chasing things that never really mattered, to find a life that felt like it was mine instead of something built for everyone else. Every word brought us closer, weaving a connection that felt less like something new and more like something rediscovered, as though we had always been meant to find each other, even if it took years of running in circles. At one point, the conversation quieted, and Daniel reached across the table, his fingers brushing against mine before resting there. The gesture was so simple, yet it sent a wave of warmth through me that made my throat tighten. "You know," he said softly, his eyes locked on mine, "meeting you on that plane wasn't just luck. It feels like the universe finally decided to stop playing games." His words lodged deep in my chest, and for once, I didn't try to deflect or laugh it off. Instead, I nodded, my voice low when I replied. Maybe it wasn't luck. Maybe it was time. The rest of the day unfolded with a kind of ease I wasn't used to. We walked through the city, wandered into small shops, shared bites of food from street vendors, and laughed more than I had in months. Every step with him made me feel lighter, as though the burdens I had carried for so long were slowly peeling away. And yet, beneath the lightness, there was a deeper current, an unspoken recognition that this wasn't just a fleeting connection. This was something real, something worth holding on to, even if it scared us both. As the evening sun dipped low, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, we found ourselves back at the river, the same spot where we had walked 2 days earlier. The air was cooler now, and the water shimmered in the fading light. We stopped at the edge, standing side by side in silence, both of us watching the ripples as if they held answers we weren't ready to ask for. Finally, Daniel turned to me, his expression serious but gentle. "I don't want this to just be a moment," he said quietly. "I don't want it to end when we leave this city." My heart clenched at his words because they echoed the exact fear I had been carrying. I swallowed hard, my voice unsteady as I answered. "Neither do I. I've spent too much of my life running. I don't want to run from this. Not anymore." He stepped closer then, closing the space between us, his hand lifting to rest lightly against my cheek. The tenderness in his touch nearly undid me, and before I could think, I leaned into it, letting the warmth of his palm ground me. His eyes searched mine, as though making sure I was certain, and then he kissed me again. This time it wasn't tentative. It was deeper, fuller, carrying the weight of everything we had said and everything we hadn't. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a promise, one that made the world blur until all I could feel was him. When we finally pulled apart, breathless, I rested my forehead against his, my voice breaking as I whispered, "I don't know where this will go. But I know I want to find out, with you." He smiled, his thumb brushing gently along my jaw. That's all I needed to hear. We stood there as the city lights flickered on around us, hand in hand, no longer strangers, no longer just seatmates on a plane. The fear hadn't vanished, but it no longer controlled me. What mattered now was the choice I had made, to stop hiding, to stop running, and to let myself be seen. And with Daniel beside me, I knew I wasn't just stepping into something uncertain. I was stepping into something true. Something worth every risk. As night settled in, I realized that the plane had brought me more than a journey from one city to another. It had brought me to him. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was flying away from myself. I felt like I was finally coming home.